Hello and welcome to our presentation today on conflict management styles and strategies. My name is Charles Rogel and I'm the Vice President of Products and Marketing at DecisionWise. I'll be moderating our presentation today. Our presenter is Dr. Marcy Fetzer.
Hi.
Marcy is a principal consultant at DecisionWise and leads a team of consultants who deliver organization development services to clients around the world. She completed a PhD in organizational communication from the University of Utah, where her research focused on the application of transformative conflict management strategies to bureaucratic organizational structures and dysfunctional communication. So I would suspect there would be a lot of dysfunctional communication in bureaucratic organizations.
You got that right.
She's an expert in organizational development, human behavior, conflict management, business communication, and interpersonal relationships, hence her being the presenter on our topic today.
Perfect.
DecisionWise has been in business now since 1996. We're celebrating our 20th year. We specialize in using feedback to promote leadership and organization development. We're growing, recently being named one of the Inc. 5000 fastest growing companies in America. We also, this presentation or this session is based on one of the modules from our leadership development training programs. In fact, this topic is so important that we include it in all three of the programs for senior leadership, mid-level managers, and new leaders in the organization. Before we begin, there's a few items I want to cover. Number one, this webinar is scheduled for 60 minutes. Everyone is on mute, so if you have questions, please submit them using the question feature on the toolbar. In fact, we encourage you to submit questions as we go throughout, and we'll hopefully address those as we go. We'll also leave a Q&A session during the last 10 minutes of the webinar. This presentation has been approved for 1 credit hour towards HRCI and SHRM recertification, and I'll email you those codes after our presentation today. And the slides for the presentation can also be found in the handout section of the toolbar. So if you scroll over to the right side on the toolbar, you'll see a little area that says handouts. Just open that up and you can download our slides and follow along if you'd like. So let's begin, Marcy, by talking about what is conflict. You know, I've got up here the dictionary definitions, but usually, you know, how does it really manifest itself in the workplace?
Well, when I want something and you want something, technically we're in conflict, even if we even talked about it. Yeah. So it can be, there's so many different levels. And
last donuts.
Yes, last donut in the kitchen for sure. And then as we fight over that donut, we can decide how we approach it and how our relationship is going to be affected as a result of that interaction. Okay. So generally, in my studies, one of the things that I really like to look at is what we call relational theory, communication theory, and in that particular study of communication, we actually diagram communication transacts. So every time I have a transact with you, there's an A and a B, and whatever I do is the A is put forth, and the B is that response. If the A and the B and then the A go control, 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 meaning I want the donut, no, you want the donut, no, I want the donut. However we say that, whether it's passive-aggressive or straight out or just by nonverbal like glances.
That's my donut.
Any kind of transacts that have that vie for control or my way, that in 3 in a row often is defined as we're in a conflict transaction.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not just the initial disagreement, there has to be a couple back and forths that happen.
Generally speaking, to really be in conflict, but even just the beginning of it is where we disagree on what your will is versus my will is. We're technically in conflict.
Yeah, and I can see even sometimes we anticipate a conflict situation and react accordingly when maybe it hasn't even developed yet.
That's right, and a lot of times it's based on misperceptions or like attribution errors. So I may think that, so a lot of times we give ourselves a lot of benefit of the doubt, and we'll judge ourselves on our intentions. And the others we're not as kind, and sometimes we'll judge them on misperceptions or their behavior, not their intentions.
Right.
And so I might jump to a conclusion. We might be in conflict without you even realizing it.
Oh. That happens a lot, where I don't think I'm in conflict with my wife. She assumes I am.
And she probably say the same thing.
Right, huh?
That's the thing. That's the trick of it all.
So as we look at this, there's of course various causes of conflict. We've listed a few here. Do you want to touch on a few of these?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, all of these can come as a result, like causes of conflict, but at the heart of it, it really comes down to control. But we may be trying to control resources. Communication is actually a manifestation of conflict more than usually a cause of conflict. However, it can become a cause of conflict, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
My behavior, my intentions, or my just beliefs might cause me to, so there's something behind it. Communicate in a certain way, and then that communication then become a cause of it, because it perpetuates the conflict.
Yeah.
Differences in opinion, again, that's like our wills are not aligning, and then competing objectives. I see something some certain way, and you see it a certain way, and then we have to decide how to find a solution. And as long as we're operating within a real competitive paradigm, or if there's what we call an active opposition to our relationship, meaning we're just sort of competitive people, and by nature we are always kind of actively opposing each other, even if it's not like we're acting like everything's fine, then a lot of that is going to come out and it's going to manifest itself more readily.
And so when we enter into a conflict situation, there's typical reactions.
Oh yeah, there's reactions all over the place, and we can decide if we're going to withdraw, if we're going to decide if we're going to fight, fight or flight kind of stuff. But sometimes we just need to pause and think about it, as you have some of these pictures up here. And sometimes it creates a lot of stress, and so we internalize it. And so conflict actually has quite a physiological effect on us, emotional effect, and a relational effect. All of these things are in part of conflict. And the thing is we don't, conflict a lot of times gets kind of a bad rap.
Yeah.
A measure of conflict in life is okay. It helps us make better decisions, actually.
Yeah.
It also can help us reduce groupthink. It can help us with our performance. Because what we don't want is artificial harmony. Like everybody's just pretending everything's fine.
Sure.
There's still a level of conflict there. We're not addressing it. But if we have too much conflict, those reactions can really take a toll on us. So we need to have a good ability to manage it well.
Yeah, and it's not, so I think we sometimes assume if there's conflict, there's going to be anger or some volatility involved, when a lot of times it could be people just, acting like we're all fine and ignoring it and allowing it to kind of fester.
As a conflict specialist, when I go in, I get assigned a lot of the tough cases, and a lot of times people will call me because they want help with, a situation that's gotten to the point where they can't do anything about it. And so people will ask me, wow, your job seems like it'd be so hard because you go into an organization and everybody's like, attacking each other or yelling at each other or whatever it may be. And I usually find that it's actually the opposite case most of the time. What I see is actually everybody's pretending that everything's fine. And then when you start to really get to talk to people, it unravels into a lot of conflict and pain, and it's more of a emotional sort of stressful thing that I see that's underlying the organization, not an outright. It's very rare that I've ever seen anyone actually explode or get really angry. That's definitely not the norm.
Okay. And so you've got a model here on conflict negotiation paradigms. What does that mean?
And so to sort of set things up, we're kind of getting into the details about conflict, but I've used this quadrant a few times, and we can go ahead and pull it up, Charles. And what we're going to see here is, and just to sort of think about the different ways we can approach conflict before we get kind of more into the different styles, which would be like accommodating and compromising and conceding. These are actually different ways that we communicate or negotiate within our daily life in our organizations. And so the interesting thing here is, as you see on the bottom, it's parties concerned for mutual outcome. So the higher level of desire for a certain outcome often will put us into a different form of communication or negotiation, versus on the other hand, parties concerned for relationship. When that's really high, that'll also give us opportunity to have different options for communication. Okay. Now, let's just kind of walk through this, and then we'll sort of move into some of the other different kinds of styles, because I think this is really useful, because sometimes people get sort of locked into there's only one way to really negotiate, but really there's four. And if we think about our communication has consequences that leads to different outcomes. It kind of helps us to understand what the possibilities are, our choices.
Sure.
Okay. So on the left hand, if we go to the very bottom quadrant there, it's distributive negotiation. Now that's where we have a concern for the outcome that's high, and usually it's monetary, but our relationship concern is actually lower. Now, when would we use this style of communication? You'd kind of think, well, relationships seem like they'd matter all the time. Well, not necessarily.
When you're buying a car.
Exactly. And so I can use a different form of negotiation based on the understanding that I'm okay to be a little bit more competitive, right? I want the best value. So that competitiveness is okay sort of within this distributive negotiation, and it's more of a bargaining style negotiation. And there's times when that's the best strategy to use or the best style of communication to use.
Sure.
And to sort of understand, of course, there's the more we can build a relationship, even in those kinds of scenarios, usually the better outcome. But if we can understand that there's times when outcome might outweigh relationship, then we can sort of operate within a different set of assumptions when we negotiate. Now, let's go over to actually performative negotiation, which is kind of a new model that's being developed right now with some researchers that I'm familiar with, and it's relatively new, and some people are a little unfamiliar with it. So let me explain this one. This is really interesting. So there's times when our communication is actually a performance, and what I mean by that is it's like we're sort of pontificating, or we're just kind of monologuing in our conflict. And so we actually don't usually start here, but a lot of times we get there. And our relationship, even though it may matter in our mind, our actions kind of show otherwise. And so we have, therefore, in our behavior, we have low concern for relationship and low concern for outcome. And that's where we kind of get into these really negative conflict moments where we're just sort of
my way or
piece, and we forget about the importance of the relationship, and we also sort of lose sight of the outcome. We just sort of kind of get on one, and we just kind of are almost like a lot of times we're ranting and raving, or we're not speaking, and we're not really doing anything positive at that point.
You really want your piece to be heard.
Yes.
But then you're not thinking, oh, okay, I just offended these people and really went off, and now what kind of outcome am I going to get?
You're going to have lower gains on both relationship and outcome. And the other thing here is to be mindful of when we're in that moment. We're triggered. We're out of our mind in a way that we're not using mindfulness. We're losing sight of that desired outcome. The sooner that we can stop doing that, whether that's take a pause in a healthy way, not say it in a negative way, like a controlling way, like I'm done with this conversation or anything like that, but take a pause or say, let's try it a new way. That's the improving communication. Let's change this and try to improve our communication the better.
So in that quadrant on the lower left side,
right,
you're not concerned about a mutual outcome. In other words, you want your own outcome for the most part, and you're not concerned about the relationship. You don't know these people. You don't care who they are. You'll never see them again. I just want to get what's right for me.
Yes.
You're saying that's still not a good strategy.
There's not really ever a good time to be in this quadrant.
Okay.
It's a place that we usually end up. It's not usually a place we should ever start, because in general, in every conflict scenario, we want to have some level of care for the relationship and some concern for the outcome.
Yeah, so if you dig in your heels here, you don't end up with the outcome you typically want.
Generally, we end up with just sort of that feeling later on of regret.
So this is where I would say, yeah, this is when you're going to go buy a car. You want the best outcome for yourself, and you don't care about the sales rep because you'll never see him again. You're saying then, no, creating a relationship or having some care about the relationship with the individual is important for the best outcome, and also understanding their desired outcome and coming to a mutually beneficial outcome is beneficial to you.
Yes. So when and if we were talking about like win-lose, so the distributive is sort of that win-lose. This is actually the performative is lose-lose. Most people end up with
not the best
outcome, not a good outcome. Yeah. And so when we find ourselves, the key is if we can find ourselves in this moment and we can pull ourselves out of it, we're going to improve both on the relationship end of things and the outcome. So it's mindfulness of realizing when we're doing it.
And it's sometimes difficult because you feel like you've been slighted in a lot of these situations. Like it's unfair. This situation presented to me is unfair. I want my way, and I can justify it in 10 different ways why it's unfair to me. And if you do that, then you still end up with a bad outcome.
Once there's some really interesting research that I'm aware of that it's once you start to go down that justification path, you're in the path of self-deception. So you have done something in a way to lead you to sort of this point, and now you're just trying to justify yourself into feeling okay about it.
Yeah.
So if you can kind of backpedal and say, hold on, let me think about what, my accountability, my responsibility in this, and try to get out of this sort of really almost ego-driven kind of communication and try to improve the communication and move into some of these other quadrants. Even the distributive one is better than this performative one. Let's talk about the other two really quick, and then I'm sure we need to keep going.
Yep.
On sort of this fourth quadrant here on the right, at the top, the integrative model. This is your win-win. This is the collaborative approach. So often we are saying here we're highly concerned for the relationship and we're highly concerned for the outcome on both sides. So we're creatively, problem solving. And I just read a really interesting article that said in organizational culture, you can't afford to not collaborate. We've really moved into a culture, an expectation of most organizations to have a collaborative sort of feel and element and even leadership style, more than a competitive, my way, the highway kind of style of leadership and culture. And I think that it's a healthy thing to do, and I think that this sort of win-win style of communication is preferred by most people. And then briefly here on the transformative negotiation style, and I spent a lot of my research here in this quadrant to just really understand it and see what place it might have within organizations. This one's kind of counterintuitive, but it'll make sense in a moment. This is what we call, in air quotes, lose/win. And this is where the most important thing in the relationship, in the communication, is concern for the relationship, where I might actually compromise or accommodate or even try and collaborate, but maybe like even give up some of my sort of quote-unquote win in order to make sure to advance the relationship and the sort of create this transformative effect. That's where you might have an employee who could really use a level of empowerment where you might, as a manager, be a little bit nervous to give them that, but in a way you're essentially saying, I want to give them the opportunity to grow, and that might take a little bit of, that might there might be a few speed bumps along that path, but in order for them to really become the employee that I see that they could potentially be, I think that sort of style of communication and growth is important. So I'm really focusing a lot on that relationship aspect and putting the outcome as somewhat secondary with the intention that the outcome in the end will even be better. Cool. So it's kind of like the ultimate win.
Yeah.
It's kind of, in a really simple way to understand it, it's like if you've ever played Scrabble with your 9-year-old nephew and you've let them win, it's because you're caring more about the relationship and the outcome of building that relationship and building that sort of bond with them versus winning the game, sort of the outcome.
Yeah, so you're looking at more of a long-term outcome or a higher outcome rather than the conflict at hand or the task at hand.
And the key drivers here are trust and respect. When we work in the transformative sort of quadrant, we're really focusing on building trust and having mutual respect and really having the relationship come first, even more than the outcome. Okay.
Great, so let's talk about some of the research on conflict, and we're going to take a lot of this time to talk about the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument and the different conflict strategies from that. You're probably very familiar with Ralph Kilmann and his partner Ken Thomas and the research there. So you want to describe a little bit about what they did and how they kind of came up with this model?
Absolutely. And they were inspired by the Blake and Luton managerial grid, and they wanted to build on that. And so they started to build their own assessment tool to try to understand the different ways that managers approach conflict and how that affects different cultures. And as a result, they built this as a research tool to understand this managerial grid a little bit better. But what they ended up building was probably our best tool of understanding conflict in organizations that's available right now and used by researchers and organizations alike. And what's so great about understanding how we operate is we can then, once we know what our sort of primary style is and our secondary style, although that depends on the situation often, we can then start to think about the quadrants that I just discussed and say, if I'm overusing competition, I'm probably within the two bottom quadrants. If I'm maybe even overusing, if that's possible, or sort of a collaborative approach, which it can be overused, then I might actually be spending a little bit too much time in the upper quadrants. And the key really is, besides the performative quadrant, most of the integrative, the transformative, the distributive, they all have a place within organizations. And so we want to be as well versed in all of the different styles of negotiation as well as the different styles of approaching conflict.
And you use this instrument a lot.
All the time. I recommend it all the time as well. So every time that I do a 360, it's my best practice to also include a TKI and often a Hogan personality inventory or MBTI, because I think the three, in my opinion, is kind of like the trifecta of really being able to help develop someone. Not only do you understand their just sort of personality style and how that affects some of the feedback and plays into that, but as well you get to understand how they approach conflict, and it gives us so many really key insights, and I think that it often really opens people's eyes up to say, you know, I can understand now a little bit more about why the tone for the team I'm leading has a little bit of a competitive nature. It's because I'm driving that as a competitive, as someone who's scoring pretty high in competition on this.
Okay. So here are the 5 conflict handling modes. You want to talk about the differences here?
Absolutely. So we're looking at assertiveness versus cooperativeness. And so assertiveness is the push for my way or my will, and the cooperative is the higher that I'm looking to be more of a team player or, you know, cooperate with someone else and what they want and what they desire. So it makes sense here with how they've sort of laid out the different styles in the TKI that we use. The competing, of course, is really about my so high and assertive, low and cooperative, and then of course the collaborative is where it's that win-win. So we're both trying to collaborate to increase what's available. And so we're being really strategic, and we're thinking outside of the box instead of just saying, okay, this is what we have, now let's figure out what to do. We're saying, how can we increase what we have to make it more? Compromising is we're sort of in this moderate kind of well, okay, I guess this is what we've got, so here you go, I'll take half, you take half of the donut, and then we'll just both be a little bit unsatisfied with our meal, but we're at least attempting to be somewhat cooperative.
Right.
Accommodating is really highly cooperative. I'm like really concerned with your feelings.
You're concerned about the relationship and not the outcome.
But almost, if we think about even in the transformative model, it almost becomes, I'm not even necessarily looking too much at the larger win. I'm more just really worried about the relationship. And so I'm kind of, instead of collaborating, which would be more of the let's work together to have the better, bigger outcome, accommodating is almost like I kind of, sometimes even begrudgingly, I'm like, okay, here you go. Like, you can just have it. And sometimes I leave feeling really unsatisfied. And then avoiding is we're both not going to really engage in the conflict. And there's times for avoidance, but for the most part, we know that a level of productive conflict is good for an organizational culture versus having everyone just avoid the issue and just pretend it's not there.
So I'll run a poll now because I'm curious to see what our audience kind of defaults to when they're in a typical conflict situation. So I've launched a poll. I'll leave it open for a few seconds here for everyone to participate. But go ahead and indicate your typical reaction to conflicts. When you come into a conflict situation, which one do you kind of default to the most as opposed to the others? Looks like we've got about a third, about half the people to respond so far. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results with everyone. So as I share the results here, Marcy, we can see that we've got only 5% avoid or claim that they avoid.
Yeah, exactly.
Have to take the assessment for sure.
To validate that.
15% accommodate, 32% compromise, 40% collaborate, and then a small number compete. 7% compete typically.
This is pretty close to the norm that I'm seeing lately, and I think it's shifting. I think that we're actually moving into a larger society of having an interest in collaboration, and so at least in theory, most people want to be collaborators, and I'm thinking that's a very positive development. And of course, there's always a fun part of competition, and we want to make sure we have that element. But when we've seen there's been so much research on what it really does to negatively to teams when we pit people against each other, or even pit teams against each other in the spirit of, oh, it's going to be great. We're going to have
competition is great. Yeah.
There becomes a lot more of like what you said at the beginning with like, what we mentioned in the beginning about like scarcity of resources, like coming into like full focus all of a sudden. It's like we were sharing. It was in our best interest to share resources generally until we got sort of in this competitive mode.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden now it's like, well, I'm going to protect my resources, and because I need to win, and even without thinking about it, it shifts everything, and it actually changes trust. It changes dynamics just in general, and the whole organization, if we don't handle it well, can actually become affected, and we see that drop in engagement numbers, etc. However, I don't want to overplay it. I mean, there are definitely times where competition, if it's handled well, can be great. I mean, it really depends on how it's executed.
Yeah. So let's talk now about pie.
Pie is my favorite kind of analogy to talk about with them, and we kind of talked donuts already, but we'll just go through each style really quick with the pie. That pie looks really good. Is it lunchtime today? I'm starving. That pie looks super good. It looks like some ice cream in here. So with the competing style or mode, as they call it, we're really just seeing this as one pie. There's no way to split this pie, and I'm absolutely in the framework of I have to have that whole pie, and if I don't get the whole pie, it's a problem. And you're in that framework as well when you're competing with me. And as quickly as I realize that you aren't going to, give me my pie, we can become in that performative quadrant pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Collaboration is, we need to figure out how to make the pie bigger. And it takes time. That's the thing about collaboration. We get sometimes impatient with collaboration, and then a lot of times we'll move into compromise or accommodate pretty quickly if we can't find a good, easy, quick collaborative solution. And my recommendation is like give it a little bit more of a chance, give people ability to have sort of the creative brainstorming and their voice in the process, because we see a lot of feedback on a lot of 360s in particular about how they want, a lot of employees or reports want to be more part of this collaborative process, and they really want their voice to be heard, and they want their opinions to be taken seriously, and that can take time. And as leaders, sometimes I think we get impatient. I mean, we're in such a fast-paced society that we sort of just say, okay, I tried to collaborate for about, a minute. Now I'm going to move into an easier mode, which is just compromise or say, okay, it's fine, it's my pie, and I won't share it with you. When it comes to compromise, that's where we would just literally take it and split it right in half and say, okay, here's your half, here's my half, I guess that's fine. And
I'll cut it, you choose.
There you go. And accommodate is, again, where I just give you the whole pie, and avoidance is there's no pie. Let's just pretend that pie isn't there, and it'll somehow resolve
I will go away,
even though that isn't likely to happen.
So let's talk about competition or how we use competing as a style in conflict.
So I think this is useful, and this comes from the TKI research, so Thomas Kilman research. And so competing uses, and when we need to make a quick and decisive decision where action needs to happen, and it's vital, that can be very important to just say as a leader, you know what, I need to do this. I had a leader that I worked with who had a number of stores that she was managing that had been affected by Hurricane Sandy. And there was a lot of freezer issues and power issues and, access issues, and she was in a situation where there was no time to be collaborating with her even leader or a team. It had to be just whatever was her, best ability to decide what to do in that role and be very decisive about it. And then the second one, which is really interesting, is this unpopular course. Sometimes as managers or leaders, we have a vision. And we really need to be careful, though, that we really understand what's at stake and how this unpopular course really will be in the best interest of our team, ultimately. And that's the transformative. So we're going to take an unpopular course or something that people might not be excited about, and we're going to take this action because we need to we really need to have the bigger vision in mind. And so that's when sometimes it's important to just say this is the way.
And that's one of the hardest things for managers, because they have to be the bearer of bad news and support the company strategy at the expense of what their employees might have to go.
And sometimes I think that managers believe that this is the case more often than maybe it needs to be. So they'll justify that. Oh, well, you know, I have the bigger vision in mind, where it may or may not actually be a situation like that where they could actually collaborate or, you know, think of some of the other strategies before just making that unpopular decision. So you got to make sure you're really on the right track there before you do that, because the whole idea of being unpopular, you're really going to have to, you're taking basically a debit from your interpersonal relationship bank.
Yeah.
And you need to sort of have that realization.
You can't do it too often.
That's right. So the vital to the company welfare is the next one. It says, and that relates to what we were just talking about, or protecting yourself from people who are taking advantage of you. That can be important, where there are times when we definitely need to stand up for ourselves. And we understand, you know, that this might take a hit on the whole interpersonal relationship bank, but it's very important that if we're being exploited or taken advantage of,
they know you can't walk all over you all the time.
We need to assert ourselves, particularly like when we feel like what we're doing is right. So we don't want to feel, we don't want to get into a victim mindset where we're feeling like we need to do this all the time, because chances are then we're not. It's not truly the case.
Sure.
But when we truly are in a position where we're being taken advantage of, we need to assert ourselves and stand up for ourselves in a competitive way. And I think that that's okay, justified.
So then we have signs of overuse and underuse.
Definitely. If you feel like you're in an organization where this question, are you surrounded by yes people, you perhaps, you can think about it from the boss perspective, from a direct report position.
Yeah.
But if all of your direct reports are feeling like they can't really speak up, and they're always having to say, okay, sure, whatever you say, yes, that'll be fine, and you can sense in there's a fear of retribution in their voice or in their responses, then perhaps you're asserting too much of a competitive style, and you should really think about other strategies that might offset that a little bit. What we're looking for is balance. I mean, one way is not best. Every way has its both pluses and minuses, so we need to just remember to have balance. On the other hand, if you feel like you're in a situation where you have to be that yes person with your boss, if you're brave enough, you might have a conversation about it with them and just say, I would really like to have a more collaborative approach with this team, and try to, that takes some guts.
Yeah, right.
But if the manager is open to that kind of dialogue, that self-awareness might be useful and might make a change in a positive way. So signs of underuse, feeling powerless in situations, having trouble taking a first stand, etc. So I think those are pretty clear. Okay, so collaborating. So if we look at the collaborating uses, we're looking for that integrative solution for all. That's always really a positive experience for most. When the objective is to learn, that's when you really want to say, okay, team, what can we brainstorm together? What can we learn together? We're a learning organization. FDR is actually a pretty famous president for his ability to do this with his team. He was really good at saying there's not really any wrong answer. There's not really any ranking that outranks another person when it comes to ideas. And so as a leader, with his cabinet in particular, he was able to really have a good collaborative, safe space with his team. And I think that the more that we can do that, the better, because people feel valued, they feel like they have a voice, and you truly have to have sincerity about that. You really do have to value them and really have to listen to their opinions, and you can't have the retributions and say, oh, that was dumb, and everybody laughs. That's going to break it down really quick. So we're looking for insights, we're looking for commitment. When someone feels like they're part of the process, of course, they're going to have more of a buy-in. And then, of course, when you need to work through hard feelings, and you really have that concern for relationship, collaboration, of course, is going to be much more effective than competing or even avoiding. The signs of overuse. It's difficult for you to see differences as opportunities for drinking, learning, or problem solving. Are you uncommitted to your decisions or policies? And essentially what all this means is you're just looking like you are a little bit wishy-washy.
Yeah.
And, you're kind of, every meeting is like, what does everyone think?
Yeah, let's discuss this.
Let's talk about this more.
It's a simple decision. Where are we going to lunch?
And then your whole team's like, well, what do you want us to do? Oh, I don't know. Let's think about it. Who has a good idea? And you kind of keep throwing it out to the team. After a while, it starts to look like a little bit of weak management or maybe weak leadership.
Yeah, and
so you don't want to do it too much.
Yeah, you don't want to use it in every situation just because it does seem to take a little bit more energy and time to come to a conclusion.
So signs of underuse, spending time discussing issues in depth that don't seem to warrant it, failing to elicit collaborative responses from others. So, if your team is just kind of giving you the indicators that they want to have more of buy-in in the process and that want more discussion, then you're underusing collaboration.
Okay.
Compromising. So when you use it, when goals are moderately important, that's the time where it's like, it's not a big deal. Like maybe I want the whole pie, but I'm fine with half of it. It might be better for me to have half of it. It's not a big deal, right? I like the second one when two opponents with equal power are strongly committed to mutually exclusive goals, as in labor management and bargaining. So, like there's a very good chance that you could end up in a sort of a deadlock sort of situation where nobody's moving. You both have a lot of power and you're both very committed. Oftentimes, there's not going to be much movement. It's important to just have the realization that compromise is probably going to be the best outcome that's going to come out of it. And so we kind of need to move into that frame of mind.
Especially with the U.S. Congress.
There you go. Temporary settlement of a complex issue. That might be like, let's just compromise for now.
Yeah, let's do this for now.
We'll split up this pie, and then when we have another pie, we'll figure out another plan.
Okay.
But for now, we need to just kind of move on. And this, even though it's a complex issue, we need to have some kind of movement on it. The next one, when you need to arrive at an expedient. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on. I'm expedited. What am I reading here, Charles? I'm sorry. And expedient solution under time pressure, of course. So you're just again you have a time pressure, you have a deadline, and then finally as a backup mode when collaboration comes. Now this is always often, I should say, not always the secondary to collaboration or competition. So a lot of times we'll just go right to compromise. Instead of just go to accommodating or avoiding when we don't get when our competitive or collaborative efforts fail.
So you feel like you got something out of it.
Exactly. Signs of overuse. So it says, do you concentrate so heavily on these practicalities and tactics of compromise that you sometimes lose sight of a larger issue? What we mean here is you love to bargain, and you're focusing a little bit too much on the whole bargaining process, and you're like, well, if I give you this, then you give me that, then you give me that, and then you're doing way too much of sort of this compromising sort of bargaining style of communication, and people start to feel that energy around people when they're always kind of trying to bargain or compromise on things, and it's not necessarily when we think about when we're looking at our assertiveness versus our cooperativeness. Remember, we're at the middle of the both, so we're not getting really good gains on either one. So we need to remember it's not great to use a lot. And then there's a second one about that as well. So gamesmanship, and some people just love to sort of barter or bargain even when it's not appropriate. When a relationship situation is in the mix and it matters more. And then overuse. Do you sometimes find, or underuse, sorry, do you sometimes find yourself too sensitive or embarrassed to engage in the give and take of bargaining? So you're like, oh, I would, but I'm kind of embarrassed to be like, how about you give me this, I'll give you that.
People hate that.
Some people hate that. You don't want to send that person to buy a car.
Right.
Because they might just accommodate and be like, okay, I'll pay full price. And then do you sometimes find it difficult to make concessions? On the other hand, it's maybe you're so stubborn in your negotiating that you can't even go there and say, okay, I'll give you a piece of my pie. You just can't even, you can't even.
There always has to be a give and take. You're always looking for the fairness of it all and the justification.
Okay, I think we have a couple more. So here we have avoiding when an issue is unimportant. This one is so important because a lot of times, I've actually had someone once say to me, a leader said, I don't understand why avoiding would ever be a good strategy. And so the key here is there's a time and place for conflict. And if you're on a sales floor with an employee and you're having a discussion about something that's actually, pretty important and probably sensitive, it might be good to avoid it for now. But that doesn't mean you can't revisit it.
Yeah.
And find a better opportunity. Also, when you kind of let the emotions sort of come more into perspective, it's sort of avoid things. There are also even times when avoiding just is fine. Just if it's not a big deal, it's not a pressing thing, and you can just, a lot of times we'll just say, well, let's revisit it, and then you realize later on you don't even want to revisit it because nobody even cares. Like everybody's kind of fine and everybody's moved on. It's like, why bring it up again if it's not really important and it's going to maybe potentially hurt our relationship?
Right. Somebody says something at the family party, and you want to say something in the moment.
Oh,
later,
badly, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, whatever. No one really cares.
And it was some dumb thing, never even really. The person, you probably think in your mind that they shouldn't have said that in the first place, and then for whatever reason, the moment you want to like defend that or you want to, criticize them, but then you realize like
lose it. Yeah.
Not worth it.
Right.
Okay. So when you perceive no chance to satisfy your own concerns. You have low power, you're frustrated by something, it's very, very difficult to change. It's kind of this mentality like there's just absolutely nothing to gain here for me. In fact, mostly
nothing's going to change.
My standing or my relationship. So that's a hard moment, but sometimes, that takes, I think, sometimes quite a bit of wisdom to realize. Like in this situation, I can't win, and in fact, I might end up hurting myself more. So it's better to just maybe avoid it. This another in the costs, I kind of alluded to that, of confronting a conflict outweigh the benefit of its resolution. We need to consider that and really say, is it worth it? And especially if I'm working with a very difficult competitive person, if I bring it up, are they going to have any interest in collaboration? Are they going to have any compromise or accommodation? And if the answer is absolutely no, and I know that potentially it's just going to harm things for me, it might be a good time to avoid. Cooling down, as the fourth one talks about, we mentioned that it's a good time to let people cool down. Gathering more information, that's a good time to say, let's talk about this after we have a few more facts.
Yeah.
That's actually called in the conflict research leveling. It's not I'm going to level with you. That's a different thing. It's conflict leveling, which means instead of asserting power or giving power or control, I should use the word control, not power, but asserting control or giving or giving control, I'm neutralizing this whole control element. So essentially, if we both want the donut and we're both vying for control, and I say to you, you know what? I don't even know whose donut this is, Charles. Like, have we even established if we can have this donut?
Right.
I'm not sure either. Like, we're not doing anything with control. I haven't said, okay, you have the donut.
Yeah.
And you say, no, whatever. It's my donut. So we are still having this control argument. If I just say, you know what, let's find out a little more information. Maybe let's revisit this donut at 2 p.m.
Maybe it's been sitting here for 4 days.
Right.
We both don't want it after all.
That's neutralizing or leveling, and that gives us, that's sort of an avoidance strategy, but it's also a really good strategy to continue to keep our relationship in a healthy place and not really engage anymore in the conflict. Okay. When others can resolve the issue more effectively, maybe we take it to someone else, a mediator, a professional mediator, or just a manager mediator, or just an outside person that has perspective that can help us. And then when the issue seems tangential or symptomatic of another basic, or another more basic issue.
You're kind of arguing over the wrong
that happens so often. And we talk about like this third conversation. So I'm having a conversation with you about something minute, and we're arguing over it. Whereas, and I'm also having a conversation in my mind, that's the second conversation about what's really going on. And then what's so interesting, and this is part of the Harvard negotiation project, is then they talk about the third conversation, which is actually what I know is really going on, what you know is really going on, and that conversation. That's that we should be maybe happening. And when
we're arguing over a donut, but it's because I think you're a selfish person and I'm not going to let you have it.
Or you got the promotion that I felt like I deserved.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take it out on the donut.
Okay. Good point. Good point.
So when we realize we're doing that and it's not even the real issue, and it's really just us kind of getting our angst out, that's the performative quadrant. Let's maybe not do that. Let's avoid that. But it's not useful. It's not helpful. It's not getting us anywhere. It's really just fueling the fire of our real issues. Does that make sense? So signs of overuse: do you fear the effects of direct confrontation? So we're really affected by this idea of what's going to happen if I actually just bring it up. I'm worried about being the bad guy. Do you sometimes feel harried, overwhelmed by a number of issues? So I'm like, I just can't handle it. I'm just going to avoid it, right? So those are all times when we're overusing it. In fact, I just had my cousin ask me if I would help her take care of her roommate problems. And I thought about this whole avoidance thing. She wants to put me in that. She's like, and she literally said, I don't want to be the bad guy with my roommate. I'm like, I don't want to be the bad guy with your roommates either. In fact, I don't even want to deal with your roommates, right? I've got my own roommates. That I have to worry about. Underuse, causing coordination to suffer because people are just not getting their input out there. So nobody's talking about it. Like, let's get a conversation, right? This is productive conflict, not avoiding conflict. Creating just walking on eggshells. Everybody's super nervous to bring it up. If you've ever heard of a couple that said, we've never had a fight. You've had versions of conflict.
Yeah.
You just created a version of this where everybody's super nervous to bring things up because you're just sort of avoiding fighting, which is actually not a productive relationship to have. You don't want to have an overly avoidant, and you don't want to have an overly adversarial relationship on either end. And then this decision of important issues are getting made by default. That's not what you want. You don't want to have these really important organizational decisions being made by default, meaning nobody's making decisions.
The last one is accommodating.
Okay, I love this one. The first one is when you realize you're wrong. Okay, so we kind of go back to the donut or the pie, and I'm like thinking it's mine, and it's really, I find out that it's really yours all along. It's like your birthday pie or something like that, and I have not had any real knowledge to base my desire for it on, and I realized, and the really wise thing to do and the humble thing to do is then to say, you know what, Charles, I'm sorry. Like, I was wrong. Even if I'm your supervisor, it doesn't hurt my power status. It actually improves my power status.
Interesting.
When in those moments when I truly did something that was wrong, and I can be, you know, noble enough or whatever, even just mature enough to say I'm wrong and I need to give this to you because it's yours, or you know, whatever it may be. And then when the issue is more important to the other person than it is to you, we have these kinds of arguments sometimes where we're in the middle of it and we're like, wait, I don't really care about this.
Right. Why are we arguing?
And they seem to care a whole lot. So I'm going to let them have their way because I know that that'll help with our relationship, and I really don't care, you know?
Yeah.
So that can be a really important time. You want to build up your social credits. That's the whole interpersonal relationship bank.
Yep.
Really, really important to realize how valuable this is as managers. When I see the feedback on different forms of 360s that someone needs to work on their communication and their interpersonal relationships. A lot of times it's because they're being too competitive, and they're not using enough of these other forms. So they're not building enough credit in the social bank. When you're outmatched and losing, and more competition will only damage your cause, you know, you have to realize, take your losses, and then kind of move on. When preserving harmony and avoiding disruption are especially important, there is going to be a point where you realize, like, we're at the brink of everything falling apart if somebody doesn't give. And so you know, I'm going to have to be mindful enough to realize when that is, and especially in leadership, to say it's more valuable to put the relationship first than just let this thing implode, and that's the transformative style of communication. And then finally, when you want to help your employees develop, which I said before, is like often let them learn by making mistakes. And so I'm accommodating your desire to do something a certain way.
Even though I don't agree with it.
I may already have the wisdom or the knowledge based on my experience that probably won't work. But what is so cool, and what I've heard and told many people and heard before, is there's this pretty cool magical moment when you delegate to someone or you empower them and they do it in a way that's more creative or has a better outcome than you even realized as a leader. And then you've actually done something pretty amazing as a leader instead of just saying, do it my way and it will work because I know it. And that's definitely more of a top-down style. This is, I'm going to collaborate, I'm going to accommodate, I'm going to help you to grow, even if you make some mistakes. Of course, stumbling is part of the process. And then ultimately they shine even brighter, which is pretty powerful. And so to just kind of finish this up, signs of overuse or accommodating, you feel like your ideas and concerns sometimes don't get the attention they deserve. and is discipline lax. So we're doing way too much accommodating. We're not really getting, we're not, asserting ourselves quite enough. That's where we can fall into using it too much.
Yeah.
Just, have you ever worked for an overly accommodating boss? It's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, because in a way you feel like there's no rules, there's no structure, there's no framework to work in.
It's just like, okay, sure, yeah, want a day off? Absolutely. Like, oh, come in late, no problem. Oh, you missed that deadline? That's okay. Like, it gets to be like too many, like, it's not enough, like, excuse me, asserting. And then signs of underuse, having trouble building goodwill, being viewed as unreasonable, having trouble admitting when one is wrong, failing to recognize this legitimate exceptions to rules, and refusing to give up. So you're being a little bit too stubborn in general.
Yeah. So now we'll get into different case studies that talk about kind of how these manifest themselves in the workplace. But I think that the end point that you're making is that all of these styles are useful in certain situations.
Absolutely.
So you might have a default style that you go to, but being willing to flex and use other styles will get you a better outcome a lot of times.
The TKIs that I've ever seen with a balanced score are usually your better managers and leaders.
Interesting.
Meaning we don't just have one or two, like dominant and secondary. We have a good measure of all five, even the avoidant.
Yeah.
Now, I would say I have never seen one that's perfectly measured, like where they're coming down perfectly, even on every category.
Yeah.
But I've seen pretty close, and they're pretty solid leaders.
Wow.
So, and it's something you can learn. It's not just something that you are born with, which is a little bit different than a lot of our personality in assessments or inventories that we take, or it's something that you've sort of established by they say oftentimes it's the age of 9.
Right.
And you can't change. Like you're either an introvert or you're not, and some of that is neurological. And I've seen a lot of research on that. It's pretty interesting. But when it comes to conflict approach, you absolutely, it's a behavioral science. It's something that you learn. You might have tendencies that have to do with your personality, but it's not something that you're walked into.
Interesting.
So let's just talk about these couple of case studies. I think we have maybe 3 here, and then hopefully have a couple of minutes for questions.
Yeah.
I know we're getting a little bit short maybe on time. This case study that I was telling Charles about, we ended up calling competition or us. It's a company that I worked for quite a long time, where it was so highly competitive. It was like you could cut that sort of feeling with a knife, like it was tangible almost, like you could feel it. And there was such a fear of saying or doing anything wrong. As a consultant, when I'd ask how are things going, I would get kind of this nervous nonverbal communication with, and sort of almost avoidant communication with like, everything's fine, because everybody had this nervousness around, what's going to happen. I have to comply. I have to sort of the will. And the competition was really top down. So it was a lot of times people were, but they were also asserting competitiveness down to their direct reports. So it was like kind of down the line, cascading. So a high level of anxiety, a lot of poor team dynamics that we noticed on our assessments of their group dynamics, and a real need to solve their quote-unquote communication problem. The communication problem was just a manifestation of the other causes, which were a lot of issues with trust, even some issues with respect, a feeling of like low collaboration, not a lot of forgiveness when you did something wrong.
So what were they doing to kind of create this culture of competition then?
They actually bragged about it. It was actually part of like their values of being a highly competitive organization that really believed that their competitive advantage was this drive for we have one way to do it, and the way we do it is best, and be kind of afraid if you don't agree with our methodology.
Okay.
And they were very also proud of how well they could promote and fit people that fit their culture, because they were looking for this exact sort of personality.
There's a lot of the same people
so
there.
It just became one another after another of this. We do a lot of TKs with the organization, and it was always pretty high on the competitive percentile. And if they weren't, they were kind of questioned with whether or not they fit in the organization. So even the TKI then was kind of perpetuating this competitive culture. Kind of crazy.
So was there a good outcome here? Did they get any better?
Yes, I think so, because as we sort of even just illuminated them to the side. We showed them the different results of the TKI and did kind of a corporate profile of it and talked about all of their 360s that said poor on relationship building, poor on communication, poor on mentoring, poor on coaching. I started to be able to connect some dots that had some light bulb effects. So as a company, they have made an initiative to become more collaborative. And I think, though, however, you know how hard it is to really change things that are really, you know, ingrained over time. But I have seen some better effect. In fact, I know of a time recently where someone made a pretty big mistake at a high level. And the comment that I heard was, this person in the past would have been fired immediately. But the new way that we do things has given us a little bit more of an allowance to let them kind of learn. And so I'm like, well, that's something.
So the lesson here really is be careful of the type of culture you're creating around competition.
Definitely aware, for sure. Okay. So this one I just pulled from a book about General Motors. Stephen Robbins talks about a famous, you know, case of General Motors where they also had historically a culture of competitiveness, and they hired a lot of yes people. And in his opinions, there was just such a reliance on their past success that they would really focus on that and emphasize that to the point where it was perpetuating sort of this disillusion about, or delusion rather, about what was really going on and how successful they were, and creating a lot of groupthink, meaning people would all have board meetings where we'd be like, okay, well, we've been so successful in the past, let's keep doing it this way.
Right.
Where someone might be like, well, I don't know how well that's working out for us, but they wouldn't be willing to speak up because there would be consequences to not saying, oh yeah, we're doing great. Look at how great, you know, we're such a, you know, monster of a
career
company.
Will get stalled
And so questioning anything like what we might, these choices might not be the best for our future, had negative consequences. And finally, one of my favorites is this case study of these two women I was working with that had a highly competitive relationship, and they both saw each other as what they called, and I talked to both of them and working with them on 360s, what they called each other difficult people.
Right.
So they both
She's the difficult one, not me.
Difficult people. And they couldn't get along, and there was so much of this relationship was affecting the culture that it was like their whole teams were on board. So their teams wouldn't work together, and because it translated with the leaders' relationship, which was so horrible. And talking to both of them, like some of this sort of personality quirks, I could sort of see how it had become that way. One of the particular people within this relationship had a very kind of almost harsh style of communication. It was very matter of fact. You couldn't really sense a lot of emotion, and so it sort of did come across as not caring.
Yeah.
So I could hear that, and the other woman was just sort of reacting to all of that and saying, "This is just impossible. She's impossible." But her own actions were then sort of reciprocating some of that. So on both ends, it was quite difficult. So the long story short is there was the woman on the airplane. This is the one that was sort of reacting to the other woman who felt like she just was not emotional and not caring. She was just had it. She had had it. If something had gone wrong, and she just right before the plane took off, right before they said close down your laptops and everything and stow your laptops, she got an email and she fired off a response that she said, I didn't hold anything back. She's like, I couldn't.
It was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back type of problem.
And in the moment, because also there was like a pressure of like timing, because she was going to be on a 4 or 5 hour flight.
Yeah.
She's like, she didn't have any time to be mindful. It was like her mind kind of got hijacked, her amygdala or whatever got hijacked, as we say, and she just went for it, right? She just went full on, and she's like, and she just typed it out, and she did the thing that I wish I would have had in that moment as her coach said, don't send it, just stow it. Just stow it, let the email sit there. You've had an opportunity
to after you land.
Write it all out.
Right.
That's actually lethargic, cathartic, thank you, process, right? So we're feeling like, okay, we got it out, we feel it's, released emotionally, but don't send it. She sent it, and then she stowed it, she put it under, and right when she put it under, she said, I am not that person. What did I just do? But because they had taken off, she couldn't then get her laptop back out and check to see what happened next. When she got off the plane, of course, the response was quite, emotional. and that she's like, this is a nightmare, you know, neither of us are leaving this organization, and what have I done? So she sent a quick reply that said, I apologize, I'm not that person. I am so, so very, very sorry. Let's have a conversation, and let's just see if we can figure out how to work this out. And she was nervous. She didn't know what would happen next, and the woman was very gracious and said, I agree, let's sit down and talk and see if we can resolve it.
Yeah.
So they both came into the conversation with a strong willingness to repair it, which is the very best first step.
Sure.
And now they're probably within the organization working almost better than anyone.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a good story. So we have some recommendations here. And do we have time to go through these?
Yeah.
Okay. So conflict is something we shouldn't fear. A lot of times we do. It can improve performance and productivity. In fact, I think the statistic is 73% of our decisions are improved when we have a level of productive conflict in our offices.
Interesting.
So it's quite valuable if it's handled right. A lot of times we need to not take everything so personally and be quite so sensitive, but realize that, you know, sometimes when we disagree with someone, it needs to just be an opportunity to have a conversation and try to just make some good resolution. When conflict is resolved well, relationships and organizations in general will improve. So we actually go into a better place oftentimes. Remember that every conflict mode, as we talked about, has value and is important. And focusing on desired outcomes and being mutual about the different conflict modes, mindful about the different conflict modes enhances our ability to have better conflict negotiations. So we need to kind of remember, like, you know, what is my real desired outcome? And in this sense, I'm talking about, is the relationship, or is like the value, the priority, or both? And then I can be strategic in saying, therefore, what style or what sort of paradigm do I need to operate in? Integrative, which is more collaborative, or distributive, which is more compromising or bargaining. And we can kind of navigate the different kinds of modes and styles instead of just feeling like we don't have options.
So let me conclude by providing here the HRCI and SHRM code. You can see them on the top of the pyramid here. I'm also showing our leadership training programs, of which this particular session is part of. And the other thing, so I'll leave a couple seconds here for a question. One question that came in is, how do you deal with someone who's stuck in one of the modes, the styles, and get them to flex into one of the other, you know, the collaborating style if they're constantly competitive or compromising in some way?
Well, I would truly suggest having an initiative to take TKIs as a team.
Yeah, that's one of the best ways.
That is really honestly one of the best ways, and having like a certified coach work with that person to say, these are some of the uses and underuses, overuses, underuses, and here's some of the different options you might have.
Because it is a great team building exercise. You understand where people are coming from, how they're typically going into a conflict situation. And
having the conversation as a team and opening up can be a huge team building opportunity. So if you say, you know, I have, you know, this tendency, and this is sort of some of the reasons why, and that might be based on just family dynamics or whatever it may be, just the way that you sort of have handled conflict in the past and some of those things that you've learned.
I was the middle child.
Yeah, I was the middle child, or I was the oldest, or I was the baby, or whatever it may be. That can be team building. If that's not an option, and the person's like, I'm kind of resistant to it and even stubborn about it, you don't have a lot of options, but there's a couple of things to know. Whatever style, so when we're talking about transacts, A, B, whatever style is presented to you, you always have the option to, in your response, to give them a different style back.
Okay.
So if you're competing with me and I'm presenting a collaborative approach, even if I have less power, the rule of thumb is that then, especially over a number of transacts, I can actually shift and move that style just by my own ability to respond. That takes some kind of thoughtfulness and some nuance, but over time that can happen, and it can actually have quite a profound result. And also meta-communication. So that's having a conversation about it with that person and say, would you be willing, and not make it personal, but just say, as a team, to kind of think about a collaborative approach and see what we could do to maybe have some more collaborative sort of dialogue with our team, and see if the person would be receptive to even having a conversation about collaboration.
Right.
And that might help too.
Okay, great. Well, Marcy, thank you very much for the presentation today. Again, everyone, I'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the slides and recording, as well as the codes from the webinar today for recertification credit. We look forward to having you join us on a future webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.